Curiosity scientia.
We pledge to learn without prejudice in pursuit of our mutual goal, perpetual noviceship. We admit that it is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice.
This is our flag and our mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens us and excites us and makes us hungry for more. Curiosity Club is made merrier by our fellow artisans at Fort George Brewery in Astoria, Oregon. Let's give a warm Curiosity Club welcome to Mark Sten.
Okay, I want to thank Tobias and Will for having me here. The reason I'm here is because I wrote a book, which you can see displayed in front of you. Check 1, 2. Anyway, this is a narrative history of Portland punk in its original phase, 77 through 81. It's extremely detailed. All the reviews are at pains to point that out. It is a thorough job, and its primary focus is local. So what I want to do tonight is I want to open it up immediately to questions you all may have. And then at some point, I'm going to speak for a few minutes about a topic that I've been mulling over lately, and I want your reactions to some questions I'm going to ask you. But for the time being, I guess I'd like to know, has anybody read this book?
I made 30 pages in last night.
Congratulations. Does anybody have any questions about the topic offhand? Go ahead, Tobias.
When you were compiling all this information, did you use other books like Please Kill Me for inspiration, or was it just more straight from your experiences?
No, I wanted to stay as far away from Please Kill Me in particular as I possibly could, because I just thought that we all deserved our privacy. And there was no privacy whatsoever in Please Kill Me. I wanted to stay away completely from people's sex lives and their relationships unless I absolutely had to. I've outed half a dozen couples because it was essential for the plot as couples, but that's as far as I'm going to go on sex, and almost as far as I'm going to go on drugs, although that's not quite as dicey, because the people that I've talked about using drugs, I've cleared it with them. I mean, I've talked to them, and it's okay with them. But in answer to your basic question, no. I'm more interested in books like Grant's Memoirs or Churchill's History of World War II than I am in punk books. You know, I want to try to do a responsible narrative history of the topic, and I want to avoid what every memoirist ends up doing, which is making themselves look good. That was really at the top of my agenda, and at some point it turns in on itself, and the very act of making yourself not look good turns into a different way of making yourself look good. So it's hopeless at some point, but you know, the answer is no. I didn't take from any music books. You had a question.
Yeah.
You had a question. Did you have one too?
I did, but later, whatever.
We'll get to you
Awesome.
first.
So what led to you releasing that in this time frame, not earlier?
I didn't know how to write until about 6 or 8 years ago. In other words, I've been writing on and off over the course of my life, but I was never happy with it. Until about 2008 or 2009, I started writing for a website for a band I was in called the Oblivion Seekers, and I realized that I was finally able to get past the problems that I'd had, and so I decided to go ahead and finish this project, which had been sitting around for 20 years. But again, I wasn't happy with my writing style until the last few years. I've had the material in files and shelved all along, and it would have been better to get to it 20 years ago because people's memories would have been that much less corrupted than they are now. I mean, everybody's memory deteriorates over time and they begin making things up. And I'm sure that I'm, you know, as guilty of this as anybody else. But I was able to check almost everything with more than one source, which keeps people from sliding too far off track.
That answered a little bit of my question, but I was just like, the first thing I noticed was how dense it was, because I thought, I was like, oh, I'll just go through this book
Yeah.
tonight, and like, I felt like if I started to read too fast, I was just like gonna completely lose track of like half the characters in there, but the first thing I thought about was like, did you have, during that time frame, did you ever have like a mindset to like, I gotta like keep track of all this stuff, or you keeping a journal or something, because it's pretty amazing.
No, I was not keeping a journal. I was just keeping pieces of paper. In other words, just the process of doing shows with a group of people involved generating memos and budgets. And I ended up hanging on to most of the memos and budgets that we were working with at the time, as well as the posters, which are an obvious thing to hang on to. You know, I mean, everybody saves posters. I got lucky with the photographs. I think I mentioned this in here at some point. Probably 80% of the book comes from 3 photographers who overlapped each other in time. That is, one of them was working 78, 79, the other was working 79 and 80, and then the third was working 80 and 81. So I was able to cover almost all the bands that are mentioned have at least, you know, one photograph, if not more, in the book. But no, I did not keep a journal. The one thing I did, at the end of 1978, I had some things I wanted to get off my chest to everybody who was involved at that point. And I wrote a 20 or 25 page document at that point that actually became the core of the first chapter. This, whatever, 38 years later. And, but that was the only, and I wouldn't call it a journal, that was a policy paper more than anything else that I wrote up and distributed to everybody to try and convince them to stop looking up to California bands and start worrying about local shows instead of out-of-towners. Next.
I was in the UK in '76, so I saw a lot of the punk that was happening there, and I just went, at that time it was very volatile and very angry and quite violent, and was that the same here?
No, not in Portland, but that's partly a reflection of Portland. In other words, I think you would have found some of that violence in Los Angeles and maybe San Francisco in '77 and especially '78. I feel kind of fortunate that we did not have, we had virtually no violence until guys from California started coming up in '79 and bringing it with them. But it was pretty much one person at a time, and so it was kind of always at a tolerable level. The other thing is that it was a mass movement in the UK, and it was extremely limited in most cities in the US. I think New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles are exceptions to this, but any other city like Indianapolis or, you know, Providence or Portland would have had a tiny scene, because it was not happening in the US on a mass basis the way it was in England. It was the dominant form of music in England by '77 or '78.
Yeah.
And it was nowhere near dominant in the US during that same period. So we were pretty much, it was a small group of people, and it was a very homogeneous group of people in the sense that in the year 1978, I can pretty confidently state that absolutely everybody was anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-homophobic. That was virtually universal among the people who were participating in 1978. And they managed to leave that as an imprint on 1979 when it began to expand out into the suburbs, but that sort of disappeared in 1980. In other words, like the number of people coming into the scene at that point sort of swamped the original ideologies that were involved, and we began seeing racists in particular. And I don't like the word homophobic because it's not really like they're afraid of homophobia, of homosexuals, but anti-homosexuals anyway began showing up in 80 and 81, whereas the original group of people was completely comfortable with homosexuals. Anything?
I'll just as a statement, you said 38 years ago, and it's really trippy because I was thinking about that when I was reading a little bit of it. Is when you I don't know, when I was a kid and I was listening to music, and I was thinking about being kind of popular or not popular, subculture, anything from 38 years ago when I was 15 or 18 or whatever, felt like fucking bubblegum rock or something. And this feels still so weirdly relevant to all of my pre-midlife crisis friends right now. It's weird, and that's 38 years ago. So I don't know, it just trips me out. I guess that's just a statement. But
Yeah, I can't think of another form of popular American popular music that took so long to catch on, because I think you can say at this point that it has sort of caught on, or at least it's a permanent part of the culture, but it took until grunge to be recognized, and I really still have my doubts about grunge having any relationship to punk. But ostensibly, it was an outgrowth of punk, and that's where I think punk first, appeared on the radar. Yeah.
Would you say it was the ideology that kind of kicked it all off, of bringing these people together, or was it more of the music?
It was the music.
Yeah.
Yeah. But for some, and I don't think this is necessarily linked, but for some reason in Portland it was linked to a progressive mindset among all the people who noticed the music. I'm not sure that there is any necessary connection between the two, but it was definitely the case that of the 50 people involved that year, it was uniformly, progressive. Yeah.
So at that time, the music that was bringing them together, what were the influences, and where was that energy coming from prior to 77?
Well, prior to 77, these people hadn't really found each other until and I wasn't actually paying attention in 77. I got together with these people at the end of 77, the beginning of 78, but I realized at that point that they had all been hanging out at a gay disco called Mildred's, okay? And I don't go into Mildred's much in the book, but that's where a number of the original punks first met each other, because it was open 24 hours a night, and it was open to minors around the clock, and these people, being virtually all minors, just ended up congregating at a disco. And they occasionally began playing actual punk records on the disco system at the rate of about one an hour, which was as much as the owner was going to allow. But he did have an audience of punks waiting for that one song per hour. Musically speaking, I think probably the first shot across the bow would have been the Ramones' first album at the end of 1976. But the Ramones are sort of an outlier in the sense that the other New York acts were not really punk. That is, the biggest New York acts that stuck were Blondie and the Talking Heads after the Ramones. And neither of those is really a punk act. What you began seeing, though, was these people were ordering imports like mad from England. I would say that most of the music they were listening to was English in origin, and not just the Sex Pistols, the Damned, and the Clash, but a lot of other, smaller bands like, who did Alternative Ulster? Stiff Little Fingers. Don't Dictate by a woman named Penelope. I forget her band's name. I'm not really an expert in punk, but I heard this stuff going by in 1978, and there was a lot of English stuff and almost nothing from America until California bands started putting out their own singles. And Portland began consuming California singles as soon as they were available. But those were fewer in quantity, narrower in scope, and usually featured much worse production than the English records. In other words, England, it was like, it was industry standard in England. They got good producers and good machinery and got, you know, well-produced albums and records out. In the US, half of those early singles just sound terrible. You know, the California stuff, the Weirdos is probably the worst, but the Dills didn't sound that good. Trying to think, Dead Kennedys sounded okay, Avengers sounded okay, but it really was amateurish in California compared to what was coming out of England. However, it was the closest thing to a domestic source for genuine punk rock, and the bands were capable of coming to Portland, which a lot of them did in the period 78, 79, and 80. Next. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
What were the radio stations playing at the time, like the late 70s? Was there any of this music?
Well, I don't know, because I wasn't listening. But the only thing I could say is that, you know, Sultans of Swing was really big one year. I mean, they did start playing, well, the Cars were big on the radio, on progressive radio. And that was actually, I don't know if this is true, I heard that those people were from Boston's punk scene, and that they made a decision to backtrack and make some money. So the Cars were big, and then the Police were big a short time after that, and then U2. U2 might have been the first band in 1980 or 81 that crossed over from mainstream radio to have a genuine appeal with a lot of the people that, you know, were listening to punk rock on the side. I don't think they cut the same amount of slack to either the Cars or the Police. But in answer to your question, the Cars, Police, and U2 would have been the most progressive things on the radio. They weren't going to touch this stuff. I mean, the Ramones in particular should have been on the radio, and the fact that they weren't was kind of an indication that nothing was going to go right, you know. I mean, that was our. By the time their second album came out and didn't go anywhere at the beginning of '78, it was like, yeah, boy, this is fucked, you know. Anyway.
What was like the punk sensibility that was going on in Portland? Did it get reinforced at all by what was going on in England or LA or whatever, or did it like clash up against what punk meant somewhere else?
Well, Portland punks shared in Portland's sort of innate sense of inferiority next to the big cities of the world, you know, and so Portland punks were definitely going to take their cues from the big cities in the US, but probably more from England than America, because America wasn't generating decent models, at least until late 78 or 79 when the California bands really got it together. But that's, I mean, that touches on one of the main themes of the book, which is, are you going to imitate somebody else, or are you going to ignore somebody else and just try to do what you had in mind anyway? And it took about a year's worth of evolution for Portland punks to stop looking up to out-of-towners and start concentrating on what they wanted to do on their own anyway. It took them a year to start realizing that their own identity was probably more important than their ability to copy someone else's identity. And then all the people who had grown up listening to records in the suburbs on their own without any surrounding social environment to guide them, ended up bringing national and international models back into the mix anyway. So the local identity thing pretty much collapsed over the course of 1980 and 81 because of a lot of people coming in who had only absorbed it from mass media rather than from excuse me, from hanging out with a group of like-minded individuals of their own. Next.
During that 4-year period, did labels pop up, or how was the music being last released, and what kind of scene was there to support it beyond sort of this group of 50 people?
Originally, yeah. Well, Portland bands were slow getting out the gate with records. I was in a band that had one out at the beginning of '78 that did not do well because the band didn't do particularly well. That was with Fred Cole in a band called King Bee. And we were the only punk band in Portland with a record out until the Wipers put one out at the end of 1978. And the Wipers is still recognized as one of the earliest punk records from the West Coast. But the Wipers had a master plan that worked out pretty well for him, regardless of all his bitching. Greg Sage did well for himself, at least for the first couple of years. He timed his career such that it came off about as well as it could have. But he was the only one that applied to. In other words, other people put records out here and there. A couple more came out in '79, a couple more in 1980. But nobody bought them. Okay, the bands weren't touring widely enough to give themselves the kind of exposure that gets, that reinforces record sales. And there wasn't a big enough market locally that anybody's self-produced 45s sold more than 100 or 200 or 300 at the time. That would be like, probably maximum sales for any of these self-produced records in Portland during this whole time period. I guess the only real exception to that would be a band called Smegma, which specializes in abstract noise music. And I guess there's a built-in market for that kind of stuff because they would routinely sell out their records eventually. Any other questions? Go ahead.
So what was the punk look here? Because in the UK it was really important that you had a certain look.
Yeah,
if you
that
were
was
a band or whatever, that was very intrinsic to what you were.
Yeah. Portland was pretty free of that, as a matter of fact. I touch on that briefly in here. The girls paid more attention than the guys did, but they didn't really pay that much attention. Punk in Portland amounted to a collapse of existing norms rather than the establishment of new norms. To some extent, it simply opened up a lot of space for people to look like what they wanted or do what they wanted, rather than establishing a new model for them to follow. Okay, there was no real dress code in Portland the way there was in Seattle.
So there was no colorful mohawks?
There was pretty much no mohawks in Portland. I don't recall any mohawks for the first couple of years at least. Plenty of people had colored hair, but pink not so much. Bright blonde and black and red. I mean, kind of your primary colors, hair colors. But the whole looks thing was, I think it may have intrigued people briefly at first, and that would have been in 1977 when England was like, bubbling over. But by the time '78 rolled around, people had kind of backed off of that and weren't really worried about it. It wasn't again until 1980 that you started seeing all kinds of people showing up in black leather motorcycle jackets, and their pants torn out just right, like the Ramones. Any other? Yeah.
You said production was like pretty low for most West Coast bands and stuff. Like, were there anybody that kind of wore it as like did anybody adopt that as their sound? They were like, oh, we have a shitty recorded record, and that's our thing.
Well, okay. First off, I must admit I stopped paying attention in 1981, and I wasn't paying real close attention prior to that, except to the local scene. I think it's probably the Misfits that made a career out of that. You know, I mean, their discography basically consists of like an exploration of all different kinds of bad fidelity. I mean, every record is a different kind of bad fidelity. But I don't think anybody in the period that we're talking about wanted to sound bad. It was just an artifact of, you know, cheap studios and low budgets.
Yeah, it kind of, I mean, that I read, it kind of seemed like you guys were actually really focused on making musicians like more motivated professionally than most of my friends who were in bands. It seemed like.
In a way, yes. But I mean, nobody had any hopes that they were going to get signed by a major label, but they were serious about what they were doing. I mean, they wanted to sound good. They weren't kidding. I mean, they did want to make, you know, good music to the best of their ability, and they wanted it to endure. And you know, they took themselves seriously as musicians, even though there was, you know, nobody expected that any of us would get signed to a major label. You know, it just wasn't in the cards. And by the time it was feasible, you know, everybody had cashed it in. I mean, it really wasn't until the early 80s that bands like the Go-Go's, for example, started getting hits on the radio.
So my question just popped out of my head.
Okay.
Was that part of the motivation, like kind of carrying that torch to like have that endure when you were thinking about writing this book? Was there any of that?
In my motivation to write the book? Oh, partly, but it was more just something to do. You know, I mean, I had the raw materials at hand, and I had the, you know, I was still in touch with, there's a list in the back of people that I interviewed, you know, so I was able to call on a lot of the individuals involved, and did so. Yeah.
Okay. So you talked about your interest waning in 1981, and after that period, what happened?
Well, things came to a conclusion. In other words, this whole group of people that got going in late '77 and early '78 started what you would consider a major project that had pretty much comprehensively run its course and collapsed by the middle of 1981. And the people just sort of dispersed, the project folded, and everybody went their own way, you know. There was almost no carryover from that original group of people into the new wave that evolved in Portland over the course of the 80s at Satyricon and like that. In other words, the original group of people pretty much weren't involved in anything that came next, which leads me to think that, you know, if this had never happened, Portland would be essentially the same regardless, you know. I mean, it's hard to tell, but I don't think we really had much of an impact on anything that came after.
You said there was like a kind of sense of like moving on for the people.
Yeah.
Can you recall if it was like a city thing, like economically or socially, or were they just getting older and wanting to do something else?
Well, I think they were demoralized by the fact that nothing had come of it, you know, and I think they just were all in their early 20s at that point, or approaching their early 20s, and realized they had to start worrying about how to make a living, you know. I mean, they'd always had to worry about it, but Now it was more in terms of, you know, what am I really going to do with my life? You know, I can't be a porn store janitor indefinitely, so what am I going to, you know, what am I going to do besides a terrible job and play music on the side? You had a question.
Yeah, I guess in terms of the book and also the scene, how important is like documenting versus reporting? Like you said, you had a lot of like the raw material and stuff. How important was that versus like someone's memory of it?
They're not mutually exclusive. I mean, you know, any sort of paper documentation, it's fun to sit there and study it because, you know, if you look at things long enough, certain facts and patterns sort of emerge out of things. The people that I talked to was partly just to verify events that I wasn't sure about, but was also to examine their motivations because you know, I ascribed motivations to people which turned out to be considerably, you know, far off the mark when I finally talked to them 30 or 40 years later, you know. I was surprised by some of the people's recollections of what they were thinking because it wasn't what I thought they were thinking, you know. But any historical enterprise like this will make maximum use of all the documents it can find and all of the recollections it can get out of people, you know. I mean, they have to be synthesized. Yep.
So, you were in, seems like quite a few projects in that span. Do you have any that you're like musically most proud of that you were like, you look back and you're like, that was my favorite, or that was something I was really stoked to be a part of?
Not that I was in. There are a couple of acts from that period that I'm like fond of, and The Wipers is probably the biggest example of that. But no, I wasn't personally involved in anything that I think is very that stands up well. This band, King Bee with Fred Cole, did do a lot of songs. It was a good band, but he has cannibalized that book pretty effectively with Dead Moon and The Rats, so that's been, you know, taken care of. Now, you had a question, did you?
Yeah. Why do you think punk arose as a scene in Portland?
Well, because it was arising everywhere.
Yeah, but specifically, what were the like social cues that led for its rise?
I don't think punk. I don't think anything about Portland turned people into punks. I think the nature of Portland channeled what kind of punks they became. In other words, I think they were going to be punks because it was happening internationally and nationally. There was going to be a group of misfits that were going to gravitate there regardless. But I think Portland had a big effect on shaping what punk meant locally here. I touched on this. It freed people from following any particular fashion path, either musically or in terms of look, and it gave people a liberal status quo to complain about rather than a conservative one, which allowed it to adopt its own sort of postmodern, post-liberal, almost amoral approach toward life. In other words, we weren't worried about Republicans. We were free to, you know, make fun of progressive mores and values. And that, I think that's kind of still true of Portland, although less so than it was 20 years ago. Now, it's getting late enough. I want to bring up something here, and I want to get your reactions to it. The U.S. changed substantially from 1900 to the year 2000. American culture started out the 20th century as a primarily European white Protestant country. And by the end of the 20th century, it was turning into something much more hybridized. There are a number of things that happened to the country over the course of that century. It finally opened itself up fully to black influence, for example. It finally managed to turn itself hip, for whatever that's worth. But those are just facets of something larger that happened to the U.S. over the course of the 20th century. And I'm trying to get an idea of how the U.S. changed in that period of time. And what I want to look at in particular is the hippie movement in the late 60s and the punk movement in the late 70s. Because my proposition, which I have not thought through completely, is that these are flip sides of the same coin, that these are basically the same moment in time, that they represent the same criticism of the U.S. Despite the obvious differences between the two and the antagonism between the two, I think that what they're saying to the U.S. is basically the same. But I want to try to home in on what that critique actually adds up to, okay? The combined hippie punk critique in the mid-late 20th century of American society. Does this ring any bells to anybody? Go ahead.
I think that they're expressing different things, but I think that they're like an identity crisis. Like we're not exactly sure like who we are or what we're supposed to be. So these are different explorations in certain extremes to like figuring out exactly like what we are. Because we're for a long time we were like one of the first cultures who had the ability to be bored or to have spare time. Which I think is like kind of an unusual thing for a huge portion of the world where most people aren't really thinking about like how to spend their spare time or like experiencing boredom so much. So I think that gives us time to like, have an identity crisis and not exactly sure who we are or how we identify. Makes sense.
That's good. It takes a certain amount of leisure to start worrying about who you are, in other words.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would also argue that both of those scenes came out of post-World War, so the larger structures of violence, and so it gives you that place where you can reflect and propagate what was that norm, and then looking at what was happening consumer-wise in terms of other social and cultural values. And so it was this breeding ground that almost made it acceptable because we have such a huge conflict happening. We're allowed to then look within and have that introspective dialogue. And it also takes all that energy, all that anger with a creative vessel where it could be borne by the citizens, since before that it was more of a reactive series of cultural creation.
Let me clear that up a little bit. So what you're saying is that something about consumer society generates an anger that's manifesting itself through creative forms?
Yep.
Okay. Why would the consumer society lead people, why would people begin rejecting that? In other words, they've finally reached a state where they have no economic worries. After World War II, the U.S. dominates the global economy to the point that, everybody has all they need. And all of a sudden, that makes us all mad.
I think some of the issue would be then that idea of creative expression. If we have this voice, and it might not be all of us, it's just a
Right.
subculture.
Yeah.
But if all of a sudden we're shining this spotlight, or this is what we're seeing, why are we not challenging? Where is that idea of when all the needs are met, how can we truly actualize as a society? And so that provided the deviant norm, which made it that almost razor sharp edge, why it was a tough pill for a lot of folks to swallow, or maybe it didn't, the wave didn't sustain.
Okay. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think specifically speaking, punk is an identity crisis, whereas the hippies are an identity affirmation.
An identity affirmation?
Affirmation. Like the punks are all about we can be maybe not better, but we can be different, whereas the hippies are like, why isn't everybody like me? The hippies is very self-centered, whereas the punks were maybe selfish, but not self-centered.
Okay, so punk isn't an identity crisis so much as a position which takes its own hostility toward the larger society for granted. In other words,
well, no, I guess if we're just talking like speaking historically, like if it's the whole the 50s, 60s, you know, the 70s being the dream of the 60s smashed, then I think it is a crisis, because it's the self-righteousness of the 60s kind of turned on its head. It's like the opposite side of that coin.
what do you think the 60s was saying to American straight society as a whole, though? Because the hippie thing started out as very much a minority phenomenon at first, and probably never really achieved majority status in any meaningful sense, even though some of the fashions and the music became predominant modes. I don't think that any underlying critique that hippiness originally, was making, I don't think that was adopted by the society as a whole. But I'm not quite sure what that critique was.
Yeah, well, I guess in terms of that, the 60s was like, not to get too academic, but it was the pinnacle of like modernist ideology, like humans being the best humans that humans could be.
Modernist ideology, did you say?
Yeah, it was like kind of the peak of modernism in the 60s, where it was like we as a people, we as individuals, we as an America can be a model, like not in like an empirical sort of way, but just personally, like we could be better, we could be perfect, like capital B perfect.
Okay. There's an optimism, in other words, to the hippie movement.
Absolutely.
Does anyone else think about that? Go ahead.
Well, you were kind of asking why you thought that the two were linked, and I think that there's a lot of like, I think at their core, even though they like totally put a lot of like, black music and stuff, like they held them up on an altar, but I think at the core, just based on my own, like, what I've seen, they're both like white homogenous movements that like delved into something else, and it was, I think, partly out of guilt and the knowledge that they were from privilege. Not all of them were. I mean, there's a huge group of them that weren't, but I feel like those people were also put on a pedestal. If you came from a really
Who was put on a pedestal?
if you came from a really shitty background, or you were like a minority, or you were black, you were something, you had something that people wanted to hear, and I think that the majority of the people that bought the records that like supported the movement and stuff were people that wanted to differentiate themselves from. This is just all like my own observation of, what I see. I don't really know if it's true, but I've always thought like there's a huge chunk of like middle class white kids who kind of feel guilty for their privilege and want to set themselves apart and like feel like whatever they're doing is worthwhile, and they try really hard because they have enough leeway socially to do that. They don't have to hold two jobs. They have a bunch of kids. They have parents that might send them to school when they decide that this isn't going to work. So they try as hard as they fucking can to, sorry for the cussing, but they try as hard as they can to do as much as they can with what they've got. And
and there's like a lot of weird emotions there. But I always thought that it was just a bunch of like, it was just a huge chunk of like, middle America trying to like separate themselves. But I feel like that's a big tie-in between the hippie movement.
Yeah, except I think to some extent there is a class distinction between hippies and punks. I think hippiness was virtually entirely a middle class phenomenon, whereas punk genuinely was spread across both the middle class and the working class. And I think that colored punk in a way that the hippie movement wasn't. I don't want to say diluted, but the hippie thing took its optimism from the fact that it was essentially middle-class kids who knew they could fall back on something if everything went to hell. In other words, the middle class in America just sort of has that sensibility that things aren't going to get unbearably bad. There's something to fall back on in your family or in society or in your skill set that's going to keep you from the breadline, okay? And a lot of punks from lower class families did not have that sense of optimism or security. And I think that gave punk an edge that hippie music doesn't have. I think it gave the whole social context of punk a sort of hostility that would have been foreign to the hippie movement. In other words, I mean, hippies were not supposed to be hostile. If you were hostile, you were almost by definition not a hippie. You were something else, you know, which is why lower class kids usually didn't make very good hippies, okay? They tended to turn it into something else that ultimately came out as heavy metal in the early 70s. You know, I mean, that group of people, I think, defined the whole Black Sabbath generation, you know? Anyone else? Yeah.
Well, I think that the hippies, it had to, and the punks, it had really to do with your drug of choice. With the hippies, it was a lot of psychedelics, so it was more mind-centered, and with punks, it was much more emotional.
Alcohol, speed.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's basically true. There was a lot of pothead punks. I mean, you know, it was the secret shame of them all. You know, they didn't want to admit it, but they would have their drinking bouts, and in between they would all get high with each other. You know, and but yeah, it is characteristic of, you know, punk that it's much more alcohol oriented or cheap speed than the hippies who started out smoking pot and taking psychedelics and ended up taking coke by the time they got into the 70s. And coke was just too expensive for most punks. I mean, it was just not on the scene, you know. Anything else? I guess I would say that what I'm thinking is that there are two basic grounds that they share in common. One of them is a vague rejection of the multinational corporation model of capitalism that's taken over the world since the 1800s. I think both hippies and punks are sort of unhappy with that as the framework for all economic activity. And I think punks made more headway in establishing alternative economic structures than hippies did, even though they were small time and they fell by the wayside eventually. But the other thing I think they have in common is that each of them comes to American society and says, loosen up and do something in life other than what you've been offered heretofore. I think both movements reject the sort of passive, consumerist, let's get through life and get to the point where we retire and then we'll live for another 15 years and die. I think each of them is a challenge to people to go ahead and take chances and engage in behaviors that would be considered extreme by mainstream society. And that's a lot of what I think they have in common, even though their specific recommendations may be opposite. I think they both share a sense of boredom with American society and a sense that it's futile to keep going through the work, produce, consume, repeat until dead process. And I'll leave it there unless someone else wants to say something. Yeah.
Yeah, just a suggestion. There's a book by Grant Morrison called Super Gods, where he has a pretty in-depth theory about how since the early 1900s, American and by extension global society has gone through phases. So it's every 20 years you're either a punk or a hippie, and that goes by what people were saying earlier, from everything. From drug consumption to clothes to hair. So if you're a punk, your clothes are tight, your hair is short, and you want to go up, you want to do some speed. And if you're a hippie, your clothes are loose, your hair is long, and you want to do some acid or some weed. And just flappers and punks and rave and just he does a pretty good job of tracing the every 20 year.
No, I mean, as I said, I think this has been trying to happen over the course of the 20th century. Something keeps trying to.
Yeah.
Now, what's the name of that book? Super what?
It's called Super Gods. And
Spell that last syllable.
G-O-D-S.
Okay.
And the author's Grant Morrison. Yeah, he's a comic book writer. He's awesome.
You had something you wanted to say?
No, it was a question.
Yeah.
Could you say, I don't know what you're
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Could you say a bit more about the economics that the punks were working out that have fallen by the wayside? I don't know anything about
Okay. In the absence of any support from major labels or other branches of the entertainment industry, punks pretty much had to stage their own shows, arrange their own tours, and put out their own records. This necessarily involved them in economic activities that, for example, hippie bands didn't have to worry about because someone else was always taking care of the hippie bands. They were arranging their tours or booking their shows or putting out their records. This was not the case with punks, and so punks were obliged to do it themselves, not just once or twice, but indefinitely over a 3, 4, 5, 6 year period. Nobody gave them a break, and they had to do everything on their own. But that only gets you so far, okay? In other words, there still are bands that are making it on their own terms. I'm told that, acts like Nashville Pussy just toured and toured and toured until they were big. And in the case of this era back here, Black Flag just toured and toured and toured until they were big, without any help from any major labels. But eventually, this stuff all just all of the Portland-based stuff, just drizzled to a close, okay? There were 2 acts in Portland that might have been capable of moving on to a larger audience. One of them just broke up. That was the Neo Boys. The other one was a band called the Wipers, which was led by a guy named Greg Sage, who basically shed his band and left town with the name Wipers and moved elsewhere to achieve the level of career that he got to. Greg always went through other labels after his first single, but none of them were really very big labels. They were all sort of custom punk-oriented type labels. And the results haven't been as, he hasn't sold as many records as he should have, Does that answer your question? Okay. Then I guess that's it. Yeah?
I guess as a conclusion, what do you see as the modern like acceptance of punk, or where does punk stand in like the modern era?
I think it's an app. I mean, I think it's, you know, one more component, you know, that can be like, you know, plugged into the modern human identity, you know, to whatever extent you want to make use of it. It's sort of available for the picking. I don't think it's, well, I actually don't think that music, I think music has only a limited capability of changing society. Okay, I think it can work along the, it can work on the edges of people's consciousness, but you're not going to have a millennium introduced by a new type of music, and punk is no exception to that. You know, I also think punk's initial shock value has been gone for decades. I mean, it hasn't been shocking in a long time. You know. Anyway. I do have copies of this book for sale if anyone's interested. They're $25 a piece, which is $5 cheaper than the stores. And I thank you for coming, and I thank you guys for having me.
All right. So we return next year. This is the last Curiosity Cup for the year on February 9th with Amber Dawn of Dirtbag Films with her talk Art and Trauma. Filmmaker Amber Dawn, director of My Rock and Roll Fantasy, will use the lens of the Riot Grrrl movement and her experiences of making a film about personal loss to explore the impact of making art from traumatic experience in a multimedia slideshow. It should be really great. And let's have another round of applause for her.